I want to introduce you now to New Zealand Forest Owners Association President Grant Dodson. About a week ago, 2 weeks ago, Forestry Ministry Pini Hanare, who I have to say is not a minister who has tended to cover himself in any glory at all, said that the government was empowering local councils throughout New Zealand to decide which land could be used for production forestry and carbon forests through the resource consent process. Now, this is all to do with forestry in this country, which has become a hot and live topic, I have to say, in the wake of many things, and two of the obvious ones are the place of slash, in particular during the natural disaster on the East Coast, although there had been plenty of downpours that had put that into the forefront of the public mind, a byproduct of the forestry process. And obviously the second one for many rural communities in New Zealand, their antipathy to good productive farmland being employed in carbon forestry. Now, yesterday, carbon forestry is trees that are planted with no intention of harvesting them, but so that those forests could enter into something called the emissions trading scheme and provide carbon credits, which is real money, real dollars, to the people who own those particular forests. Joining us to talk about those issues this morning is Grant Dodson, who is the New Zealand Forest Owners Association president, but is also chief executive of Dunedin-based City Forests. He joins us this morning. Grant, thanks very much for joining us. Nice to have you on the show.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
First of all, City Forests, mate, I know you're the chief executive, but is that the one that's owned by the Dunedin City Council?
Yeah, that's correct. It's I think it's New Zealand's oldest forestry entity still in continuous ownership. We're 117 years old. A considerable asset for the Dunedin City Council that provides dividends to the ratepayers and benefit to the city.
Okay, and you're now the president of the Forest Owners Association. I'm looking at your elected members. You've got, it's got everybody on it: Tasman Pine, Forest Enterprises, Duke in New Zealand, Forest 360, PanPac, Raonier.
Yeah, look, we represent about 70% of the planted forest area in New Zealand and about 75% of the forest harvest. But it's probably important to say, noting your introduction, that we don't have any members that are doing pure carbon farming. Many of us are doing forestry and carbon, but it's commercial forestry intended for harvest.
Okay. Nevertheless, some of your people are involved in carbon farming at the moment. So two issues.
Well, not forest owner members, but there are certainly people in the forest industry that are doing that. Yes,
right.
They're not Forest Owners Association.
Would they be allowed to join the Forest Owners Association if they applied?
Look, we've got a little bit of a point of difference, and it comes from so forestry is in commercial forestry, which is growing for a tree crop for harvest, and can also be registered under averaging in the ETS. It's very much a commercial and very much a profitable land use. It's New Zealand's third biggest export industry: dairy, sheep and beef, and then forestry, we're only just third. So, we have $6.5 billion of export revenue. We employ lots of people, okay? So but if you look at carbon farming, it's certainly, as you indicated, is a piece of land that's effectively being locked into carbon farming, and it's not going to otherwise contribute to the productive economy of New Zealand for quite a long period of time, right? So that's where we have a little bit of point of difference with that, with the carbon people. So we do appreciate that carbon farming has a role, particularly on land that's unlikely to be productive for other uses. So we don't want to see it banned, but it isn't something that FOM members actively do. We're all about commercial forestry.
Okay, but here's the issue. When the government announced that it was going to tighten the rules around farm to forestry conversions, you got involved and you said, well, you were slightly critical, in actual fact. You see, you've got to get the balance right by giving communities a voice while not restricting the purchasing of land or ability for farmers to choose to sell their farms to whomever they want. So you were sort of going, I don't know, I like the idea that, well, ironically, the Dunedin City Council ends up with the right to determine whether or not that land should be used for forestry or not.
Oh, look, let me explain further. Right? So the regional councils around the country are definitely pressed, and they have limited forestry knowledge, and some of them are pro-forestry, some of them are definitely anti-forestry, right? So if you're looking at commercial forestry, which is what City Forest practice, as does forest owner members, then we're just a productive land use. It's just a crop, right? It's no different than Swedes or turnips or wheat. It just takes longer to grow. There's lots of examples of land use flexibility where trees have come in and out of on the landscape and then off the landscape, just like we have dairy booms and sheep booms. And it's that flexibility of land use that makes New Zealand a wealthy country. So if you're looking at commercial productive forestry, it shouldn't be consented. Landowners should be allowed to choose the most economic land use for their particular piece of dirt. But going back to carbon forestry, that's where there is, I believe, a role for consenting, because you're taking that piece of land out of the productive economy for a period of time, and I think there's a choice to be made about exactly where you do that, right? So that's where the consenting comes in. The problem we've got is that the messages that have come out of our political leaders have not clearly isolated or clearly defined us as being absolutely quarantined to permanent forestry.
So your problem really is that the decision that you think should be made either by an individual farmer saying, I think there should be a forest rather than a sheep and beef farm, or alternatively by a government setting quite strict regulations as to this is where you can go, this is you can't. That decision is going to be transferred to regional councils who you say simply do not possess the expertise to be able to make those decisions.
Absolutely. Absolutely correct. And it's, we've always had land use flexibility where the landowner can decide the most economic use of their land. It's really important for the long-term benefit of New Zealand that we retain that, right? When you're looking at permanent carbon farming, I think there's a question about that, because you're taking land out of that permanent economic use for a period of time. So there's a question about whether that should be consented or not. But we're clearly against the consenting of commercial forestry.
Now, I've noticed also some of your members, Grant, they were involved or tied up in some way, affected by the recent cataclysmic Cyclone Gabriel that affected the Tairāwhiti and Hawke's Bay area, Pampac Rail.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
They were right in the middle of that. And as a consequence of that, there was an instant sort of inquiry. I don't know if inquiry is the right word, but some sort of investigation that Heka Parata and others were involved in that you'd know about.
Yep, that was a ministerial inquiry.
Yep, that came out and said that basically forestry had lost its social licence to be forestry in good parts of the Tairāwhiti and East Coast area. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, look, I mean, the first thing I'd say is, look, that was a terrible disaster in the cyclone, right? Now, there was 0.5 metre of rain fell in 24 hours, that varied across the catchments. But look, that Tairāwhiti area, that is some of the most highly erodible soils in New Zealand. Forestry was planted there to try and stabilise it. After Cyclone Bola in the 1980s, we didn't get it quite right. But like everything, it got destroyed in the cyclone. We had thousands of hectares of farmland fail. We had water supplies, phone systems, certainly the public roading network. It all failed, as did some forestry land. But that's in Gisborne. If you look up Hawke's Bay, then the real story in Hawke's Bay is not the damage that forestry did, but how well it held the land together. There's tens of thousands of hectares of forest land that has demonstrably held together better than farmland in Hawke's Bay. And sure, there's been some failures in forestry, but they're very, very limited.
Well, obviously, the other issue was
you've got those highly erodible soils.
Yeah, and that was the other issue.
So the issue
was the continuing slash issue, Grant, in that particular issue. And I mean, we've all seen, I think Television One, for example, their flagship TV program Sunday, did something on the slash problem in particular on the East Coast. And at the end of the day, you guys were painted pretty much like, well, certain of the environmental sector paint dairy farmers as being the problem rather than part of any solution or problem. You were the problem and your ownership model. How did you take that criticism?
Oh, look, I think it's grossly unfair, and you actually need to look at the history. I mean, look, there's no doubt that a lot of slash came down, and there's no doubt that there's been some impacts from that, right? And the forest industry clearly needs to do better on those high at-risk catchment areas. I'm not shying away from that, but if if you're harvesting a block and you move all of the slash miles away from the waterway and put it on a bench landing, keep it well out of the place, and then the entire hillside collapses, putting thousands of tons of sediment, whole trees and slash into the waterway, well, that's a natural disaster. That's what happened. So it doesn't mean we can't do better, and we will have to do better as an industry. But at the end of the day, the climate impact on those highly erodible soils was just catastrophic. And we have to look at the history going back hundreds of years. They never should have been cleared of native forests in the first place, but they were, and that's history, and now we're trying to fix them up again. The forestry that was put there for erosion control in the late 80s and 1990s, and it was all planted to try and stabilise the land. And it actually did so for 30 years. It was only when it got harvested that we started having issues.
Well, there were sort of foreseeable issues, though, weren't they? Because if you're going to plant them there to stabilise the land and then you're going to take them down again, then they're not stabilising the land, are they, anymore?
Well, look, the reason they were planted is because farmland was falling into the sea in terms of thousands of tonnes of sedimentation.
Yeah.
Native forest has come down along with shipping containers, boats and all sorts of other rubbish. Everything's been washed into the waterway by that amount of rain. So it's been pretty difficult, but certainly forestry space has been a problem. We need to do better. We acknowledge that, and industry's working on those issues.
All right, and finally, do you yesterday afternoon, I'm sure you will have seen it and taken a professional interest in the government saying the emissions trading scheme is, well, we all know it's failing. The Climate Change Commissioner says it's just not fit for purpose. I think the Parliamentary Environment Commissioner said pretty much the same. I had Craig Stobo, one of New Zealand's leading business people, on this week say it's a disaster. And so the government are proposing a series of changes around the use of forestry to try and get New Zealand's emissions under control in terms of our international agreements, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Accord, blah, blah, blah. Do you see a role for your industry in that? And what was your reaction to yesterday's discussion paper that was released? It's
totally misguided. So let's go back to basics here. A tonne of carbon is a tonne of carbon. It doesn't matter where it happens in the world. It doesn't matter who generates it. If it's saved from going into the atmosphere, it has an impact. Now, we all know that as a country, we need to reduce gross emissions. So what I mean by gross emissions is the burning of fossil fuels. But the reality is that New Zealand's target is a net emissions target. The target for 2030 is that we will reduce our 2030 net emissions to 50% below the 2005 gross emission level. Okay? So what New Zealand needs to do is reduce its net emissions in the least cost way, because it's the taxpayers that are going to be paying for it. Now, forestry is the only part of that equation that is currently on track to meet the climate change target of about 400,000 hectares being planted. But before it's even got started, everybody is panicked, and the collective action of announcements from the Climate Change Commission, from the political parties, and the latest one on that consultation yesterday has just totally destroyed investor confidence in forestry. So the emissions trading scheme isn't failing. It's doing exactly what it's incentivised to do, which is to encourage emissions reductions. And the first point where it's doing it is in a modest amount of land conversion of farmland. Now, we're only talking, there's about 8.5 million hectares of sheep and beef farm in New Zealand, about 13 million hectares of total farmland. We're only talking about 400,000 hectares, which is less than 5%. This can easily be accommodated on farmland without even being noticed on the more unproductive parts or wherever it's appropriate for that landowner to put it. And for some reason, everybody seems to be panicking about a degree of trees on farms, and the whole thing's being stymied. The emissions trading scheme's working fine. The reason we don't have gross emissions reductions is because the technology is not available yet. And it was always envisaged that forestry would assist people to meet their emissions in the short term through sequestration before gross emissions reductions could be achieved, if that makes sense. And you also can have a long tail. It's going to take ages to reduce farmland emissions from livestock and fertilisers, so forestry needs to cover their can there for a period of time.
So that's a completely different take on what we're hearing from the government and from environmentalists, from the Parliamentary Environment Commissioner, from the Climate Change Commission. You've got a really interesting...
People are being zealots, Michael. They're focusing on this gross emissions reduction. So the reality is that if you own a trucking company, you can't go and buy hydrogen or battery trucks right now. They don't exist. They will in 10 years' time, or maybe even 5 years' time, but they don't exist now. You can't fly an electric plane. You can't do a whole lot of these emissions reductions. Even our electricity network isn't fully green yet. There's still a huge amount of coal being burnt at Huntly. So we need to be offsetting some of this stuff until this technology becomes available. And the forestry part of it is working. It has been working. And it is absolutely right for the Climate Commission to also focus on gross emission reduction. But that doesn't mean they need to cancel the whole forestry thing, which is exactly what's happening through the collective action of all of these measures.
So
it's going to be to the detriment of New Zealand. Because, well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. The Climate Minister has already come out and said to meet that 2030 target, we've got a shortfall and we're going to go overseas. And I think the Treasury estimate is we're going to spend $23 billion on overseas carbon credits. Those credits will then be brought back to New Zealand and cancelled. Now, I think I'm right in saying that when the government changed when the Labour government came in, New Zealand had a national debt of about $33 billion. So we're talking about spending 2/3 of our national debt at that point in time on overseas credits, which we're going to bring back in and just cancel. That's an absolutely ridiculous scenario when we could be spending a whole lot of that money on putting trees on the New Zealand landscape in the right place. And then we have farms that have diversified income from farming, from wood revenues in the future, and also from carbon credits. So we're much more resilient. We're stabilising a lot of our catchments, providing even flows of fresh water. And we can all do that, adding to the New Zealand economy in a productive way, rather than throwing all this money away overseas. Because that's where it's headed.
I think your commentary is challenging, Grant. I think that you are seeing the emperor without clothes, and I thank you for drawing that to our attention this morning. And let's just stay in contact, because you're going to be at the end of some, I imagine, pretty pointy policy heading up to the election time. You've got a policy or a plan to push back against that?
Well, look, the issue we've got is we've just had this collective death of 1,000 cuts. There's been Climate Commission advice, there's been political party policies, there's this recent consultation. But, all in all, it's extremely depressing for the forest industry. And I would predict that there'll be quite a bit of planting this year because it's happening right now. There'll be next to no planting in 24, 25 and 26. And the collective impact of all this will mean that jobs will be lost in forestry and planting and forest management. And it will take years for investor confidence to recover unless some very quick and collective action is taken by all political parties and the Climate Commission pretty much immediately.
Thank you so much, Grant. It's been a pleasure to talk to you this morning. I'll talk to you again soon. That is Grant Dodson, the Chief Executive of City Forest Limited, but also the President of New Zealand Forest Owners Association. That is a completely counter-narrative than you would have been hearing in the mainstream media for the last month, 2 months, 6 months, 5 years. And it is a counter-narrative that is critical to this debate. Very important interview. And we will be talking further on these issues because they ain't going away and they're coming to your back pocket very soon. Straight after this, we will be talking to Tony Randall, Councillor Tony Randall, from the Wellington City Council to do with a little scandal. It's sort of I was going to say it's a mini scandal, but it's not. It's the benefit of good governance and why you shouldn't trust bureaucrats, but also Wellington's incredible love of public transport versus the private motor car and choice.